Good morning, dear guests, students, professors, colleagues, media representatives. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome our honored guest, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Madame Christine Lagarde. The IMF has been a trusted and valuable partner for Georgia, and indeed for any other country for years, both in providing financing support, policy dialogue, and capacity development. Managing Director Madame Lagarde is the first woman to chair the International Monetary Fund since its inception almost 75 years ago. But that's just one of her numerous firsts. Managing Director Madame Lagarde was the first female chair of the major international law firm Baker & McKenzie. She held several ministerial posts in the government of her native France and was the first female Minister of Finance of a G8 economy. In 2009, the Financial Times ranked her the best finance minister in the Eurozone. According to Forbes, she is the third most powerful woman in the world. Managing Director Lagarde's career is a shining example of women empowerment, both in private and public sectors. I would encourage the female students attending our discussion to take a particular note of that. Myself, as a father of 3 daughters, her professional career is like music to my ears. Today, the Managing Director, Madame Lagarde, will deliver a speech on a very interesting and challenging topic, which is inclusive growth. For countries like Georgia, where we still have a certain share of population living below the poverty line, sustainable economic growth, which ensures the equitable distribution of resources, is essential, because growth must be beneficial for all layers of the society. I do remember that 20 years ago, when I was studying in Georgia or in the United States, we would not talk about inclusive growth. We have been talking about the growth only. And now it is clear that we have to talk more and more about inclusive growth. After her speech, we will have time for questions and answers. This is Managing Director Lagarde's first visit to Georgia, and on behalf of the Georgian authorities, I want to express our sincere gratitude for her visit to our country. This is one more sign that International Monetary Fund pays equal attention to both systemic economies and small countries like Georgia. I hope she will enjoy her stay here and will have fond memories of our hospitable country. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the Managing Director, Madame Christine Lagarde.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Mr. Governor, and good morning to all of you. I'll try my Georgian. Dila prividobisa. Okay, so. I want to explain something to you because you probably had to wait a little bit, and I apologize for that. And while you were waiting, some very diligent people put up a podium, and you probably wondered why. So many of you will have speaking engagement and will be called upon to take the floor in various instances in whatever position you have. And there are 3 things to remember. If you want to be seen, stand up. If you want to be heard, speak up. And if you want to be appreciated, be brief. Now, because I'm not sure that I will check the box on being brief, I really wanted to be seen and to be heard. So that's just a piece of advice for whenever you speak and whenever you actually have to make points. It seems trivial, but it's not. I would like to thank you, Governor Venetadze, first for your introduction, and second for introducing me to some of the characteristics and peculiarities about Georgia monetary policy and Georgia in general. The governor, you will be interested to know, hosted our entire group, and they're all sitting at the front row here. He hosted us last night for a lovely Georgian dinner in order for us to be acquainted with the beauty of this city and the habits of good food, good wine, and toasting. So I think we got that. Now, when I drove this morning, or was driven rather, and walked around a little bit, I was struck by the magnificent view of the old town of Tbilisi, which clearly has become a top destination for many visitors around the world. And many of them, just like myself, are drawn to those streets that have been shaped by a unique contribution of traditions, culture, and commerce at the crossroad between East and West. And I'm sure, as you all do, you take short walks, as I plan on doing during my visit for 2 days. You see Christian churches of various denominations, a mosque, a synagogue. Actually, last night, one of the guests was pointing to the direction where both the mosque and the synagogue were standing next to each other. And they together symbolize some of the key ingredients of Georgia's success: tolerance, openness, and the ability to learn from the past. And indeed, after regaining independence back in 1991, Georgia went through an exceptionally challenging period, including a sharp drop in living standards and a collapsing manufacturing sector. And these painful economic scars marked the beginning of a new chapter. Over the past generation, Georgia has written a remarkable story of transformation by shifting the economy from a heavy reliance on agriculture towards service industries, including tourism, which is why I mentioned all those wonderful sites, lifting average income, boosting trade, and creating one of the world's most welcoming business environments. Now, this transformation has been driven by hard work and a firm commitment to economic reforms and openness. But at the same time, as we've seen in many places around the world, openness also creates vulnerabilities and sensitivities to any of the economic trends, as well as the economic shocks that can hurt economies. And we've seen that during the great financial crisis. And that is the reason why Georgia is implementing this set of reforms in order to strengthen its economy and be able to resist those shocks and ride the waves of those new economic trends. Now, clearly, we are supporting those reforms, and the program designed by Georgia is intended to address the specific needs of the Georgian economy and of the Georgian people. Our understanding of the longer-term goal is to catch up to living standards in Europe, to unlock the full potential of the Georgian economy and the Georgian people, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're women, whether they're men, here in Tbilisi and across the country. So once again, Georgia is drawing a new economic chapter. But Georgia is experienced in drawing new chapters, because year after year after year, you have to draw new chapters when it comes to an activity that goes 5,000 years ago and that originated in Georgia. Okay, question for you, what is it that I'm talking about here? 5,000 years of age, originated in Georgia, famous around the world. Yes, thank you. And every year, you actually need to reinvent and to identify exposure to the sun, nature of the soil, what vintage will be produced. And you know, for those of you who have participated in wine picking or winemaking, that it's all a matter of resilience and creativity. Not all vintages are perfect. Vintages are going to be different. Factor of many variables, but it's about resilience and creativity. And I'm saying that because those are the two topics that I want to address now, because they will matter in the economic developments of Georgia and in the reforms that are being conducted for your future. First, resilience. How can Georgia strengthen itself to withstand the economic headwinds it will face in the months ahead? Why is that? Because Georgia is an open economy that depends largely on external demands, and as a result, it has to be strong enough to withstand the good times, but also the hard times. The second is creativity, and clearly Georgia needs always to build new ingredients, in particular if it wants to reach that stage that you mentioned, Mr. Governor, which is the inclusive and sustainable growth. Just a bit of history for you. I've been a member of the G20 discussions ever since 2007 at leaders' levels. In those early days, when everybody was confronting the financial crisis, we were talking about solid, balanced growth, because we had weak, the trauma of the great financial crisis brought many economies around the world down, and we had very unbalanced growth. Now that terminology has changed over the course of time, and that's when you know that words actually matter. We don't talk about solid and balanced only. We talk about solid, balanced, sustainable, and inclusive. And each of the four qualifiers actually matter when it comes to growth. So let me start, before we head into the resilience aspect of how the Georgian economy can be strengthened to resist the hard winds, let me just give you a quick snapshot of the global economy and how we see it. 2 years ago, you would have asked me, I would have said, we are cruising at 3.6%, 75% of the global economy is actually growing, and we will be seeing that kind of good growth. You're asking me today, 2 years later, that forecast is for this year not 3.6, 3.3. And 70% of the countries of the global economy that were actually growing at a good pace are now slowing down at a good pace as well. So we expect that to hopefully change over the course of 2019 with an uptick in growth. And our forecast for next year, 2020, is actually 3.6% as well. But it is predicated on some of the trade tensions in particular abating. A lot is to be seen in that regard. And that's the reason why we've called this moment a delicate moment for the global economy. So what are the steps that Georgia can actually take to cultivate a more resilient and more vibrant economy? In many areas already, because of the reforms that have been undertaken, you are producing a good vintage for Georgia. Over the past 2 decades, extreme poverty levels have declined by nearly 3/4. Life expectancy has increased by about 6%, and real per capita income has almost tripled. But that's not the whole story. More recently, Georgia has implemented bold policies to boost economic resilience. Fiscal deficits are contained. Inflation is subdued. Banks are well capitalized. And unemployment has reached a 15-year low. So it is not surprising as a result to see economic growth robust, and its forecast for next year pretty strong as well. 4.6% this year, and maybe a little more next year if reforms are implemented. Those are remarkable achievements. At the same time, the Georgian economy remains vulnerable to external shocks in particular, especially if we see escalating trade tensions and financial market volatility. What can be done? Well, policymakers can actually guard against these risks in a comprehensive manner. From maintaining exchange rate flexibility. Why is that? Because it's a buffer in case things harden up a little bit out there. It will give Georgia a competitive advantage. And for an economy that is actually driven by external demand, it's critically important to not have that rigidity. Second thing, increasing foreign exchange reserves, just to be safe and stable and to have enough sort of months of trade in the bag as a safety valve. To implementing prudent economic and financial policies. I understand that the capital market is under review and with potential development. Well, as some proverbs say, hasten but slowly. And I think that that applies to capital market developments, particularly when it can be done on a more regional basis and in a coordinated fashion, not with only the national market as the jurisdiction. We believe that there is room to further reduce the amount of loans and deposits denominated in US dollars. Now, why is it important? Because dollarization has left many companies and households vulnerable to sharp exchange rate movements that could undermine their financial health. Georgia has come a long way. It should have the strength and the confidence to not rely on other currencies. Progress on this issue has been realized by strengthening the balance sheets of banks and by improving financial literacy. Now is the time to take the next steps, such as further developing, as I said, the local capital market, promoting institutional investors who could support demand for long-term local currency bonds and other financial assets. I think all of that in good and intelligent coordination with neighbors, particularly in the CCA. Another policy priority is to reduce debt levels, especially among low-income households. I know some measures have already been taken, and that is good. This is an important step forwards in order to have more sustainable credit growth, which is good for individuals, which is good for the economy at large. You don't want to run ahead of yourself on that front, because vulnerability and exposure could actually come back to haunt you and hurt. But even as policymakers face those many challenges, they also need to address what many regard as a higher potential threat, which is the high economic inequality. In the region, Georgia holds many firsts that it should be really proud of, but it also holds the first in income inequality. Now, why do I say that? Some people would argue that some inequality is actually good because it gives you an incentive. Yes, granted. I'm saying that because we have done enough study on the impact that excessive inequality has on sustainable growth. And we know that excessive inequality is also associated with marginalized people, damaged community, and eventually eroded trust. When trust is eroded, there's not much that you can do to actually change society and strengthen it and make it better. So these issues are at the very heart of the government reform program, anchored in the association agreement with the European Union. And these reforms are intended to accelerate the convergence toward European-style standards and sustainable growth. I'm talking here about the emerging European countries. Now, we at the IMF are working hard in partnership with Georgia on those and many other pressing issues. We give policy advice, we give financial support, we give a lot of technical assistance in very tricky and technical matters, and we are very deeply committed to this partnership with Georgia. So let's move now to something which has more to do with sort of framing your own vintage, looking into the future, embracing the medium term, and finding out what will actually produce that inclusive and sustainable growth that we all aspire to. I'm going to go into 3 areas, which in our view will make a difference. But the ultimate goal is clearly to make sure that there are jobs, that there are higher quality jobs, and that there is better productivity. This is particularly appropriate and fitting for an economy where aging will become an issue. At the moment, long-term GDP growth is approximately 5.2%. If we take that 5.2%, it would take more than 10 years for Georgian living standards to reach those of emerging European nations, which, you should not take that as it's not disappointing, it's not to be discouraged about. It just shows that you really need to apply the right set of policies in order to make sure that that period of time is, if anything, shorter and not longer. And that's where creativity comes into play and has to be country-specific. So let me just go through a few of those new ingredients. I would say the first new ingredient is connectivity across borders. I know that Georgia is working hard to transform itself into a transport and logistic hub connecting the East and the West, Europe and Asia. And this requires clearly scaling up the infrastructure and good quality infrastructure. The roads, the railroads, the deep sea ports. Work is underway on the East-West highway connecting Azerbaijan and the Black Sea. And the benefits of upgrading Georgia's port infrastructure, including these new deep sea port, will be tremendous. These types of projects will lift productivity growth by connecting local businesses to global value chains, and by encouraging more FDIs in companies that produce tradable goods and services. And indeed, the export sector has proven to be a key driver of growth in the past 2 years, holding out the promise of new jobs with higher wages. And we were talking earlier on about tourism. This is clearly the time to actually unlock that tourism sector that can be such a vibrant sector of the Georgian economy. And the same goes for the agreements that were recently entered into with the European Union and with China. It is under those FTAs that you actually encourage trade and eliminate barriers, whether they're tariffs or non-tariff barriers. But you can talk as long as you want about eliminating non-tariff barriers. If you don't have the roads, if you don't have the connections, if it doesn't end up in the right place so that it can travel further, it's going to be of limited effect. So you need both. Second ingredient, so we've been talking about the connectivity in terms of hard infrastructure. Now we need connectivity between the brains, because that's where the soft power is going to actually prevail. And connectivity between the brains requires that the brains be actually developed properly. And that's where the focus on education that you have heard about, which is a broader effort by the Georgian authorities, is perfectly appropriate. When you read the World Economic Forum report on doing business, when you talk to foreign direct investors, when you talk to the corporate community, they will all come up with the same thing. Georgia, great, good destination for investment, but the problem is that we cannot find the right set of skills, the skilled people that will actually do those jobs that would be created. So, if anything, it's a good reason for the authorities to embark on this reform of the educational system and to move towards not quantity education, you have that, many countries have it, but the quality education that will actually equip, not you because you are super skilled already, but many of your friends from childhood to have the right set of skills. And that in turn could propel higher productivity jobs, especially in financial services, in transportation, in tourism, where you don't need the scale of a large population, but you can scale up by providing added value services. That will be a game changer. And the key is really to implement the reform that is truly comprehensive and yet fiscally sustainable. So, when I was finance minister back during the financial crisis, actually, we were very focused on that. And I remember those qualitative studies that we were doing, comparing countries. And the countries that did the best in the quality ratings were not the countries that did the most in terms of fiscal spending. So it's not that I'm advocating fiscal constraints and restraint. It's just that it's a focus on the quality of the education. Now, of course, the benefits of education reforms will be felt over the long term, which is why I was saying we have to project ourselves into the medium term as well. In the short term, there is room for more active labor policies that will have an impact in the short term, whether it's a focus on those unemployed, of those that are trying to access the labor markets, and there are policies that have been experienced by many countries around the world that actually work. Better vocational training, using cutting-edge online tools for job matching. But there is also one significant market of talent that is untapped. When I look at the participation numbers for women in the workplace, those numbers are too small. And the Georgian women are too strong to be left to the side. If they want to access the job market, it should be facilitated. And there are multiple policies that can be implemented to that effect. We have measured, and this is the beauty of modeling, but we have measured that differences in labor force participation between men and women result in significant economic losses for Georgia. So if we were to fill that gap, so same participation, which I believe for men is 74% and for women is 56%, if we were to close that gap, which will not happen overnight, but assume it happens overnight, the additional growth for Georgia is how much? Per capita, 11%. Now, 11% GDP per capita add-on is a significant margin. As I said, several policies can make a difference. Regulatory, they don't cost anything, encouraging flexible work and making sure that there is equal pay for equal work. High quality childcare. That would help women actually, and parents, not just women. And you're a vivid example of that because you and your wife actually are very engaged professionals. It helps both the father and the mother. So let us take inspiration from Shota Rastaveli, one of the greatest Georgian poets, who once said, sorry, I'm translating here, lion cubs are equal, be they male or female. True. Now, my third ingredient, you will not be surprised, because I've been saying that during that trip, both in Kazakhstan and more recently in Uzbekistan. The third ingredient, in addition to the one that we've just mentioned, connectivity, education, space for women in particular, my third ingredient is good governance and institutional reform. We know, and I often mention Georgia around the world, we know that Georgia has had a remarkable track record in fighting corruption, especially when it comes to bribery. Prime example of the anti-corruption campaign in the early 2000s. And this involved not only legal actions, but also reforming the civil service, improving tax administration, simplifying the tax code, and enhancing public financial management and transparency. And as a result of that, I think we have established at the Fiscal Affairs Department at the fund that there is a direct connection between actually better governance and better fiscal revenue, which have increased from 12% of GDP to 25% of GDP. That's bonanza for the fiscal authorities. So everybody on government should be encouraged to pursue that anti-corruption fight, which we believe is an endless journey. It exists in all countries of the world, but it needs to be fought head-on, year after year after year, government after government after government. And it requires the cooperation of all branches of government, and it requires that the legislative, the executive, and the judicial be all on the same plate, fighting corruption. In Georgia, we believe that there is room for further strengthening of public institutions to provide a more level playing field for the private sector. And that means taking the right steps for a strong and independent judiciary system. I'm a lawyer by background, by the way, and I know how critically important a judicial system can be for the overall architecture of a fair and just society. It also means building a more efficient insolvency regime. Think about it. In this country, record setting takes 2 days to start a business. Wow, that is impressive, I tell you, because I see it everywhere in the world. There are not many countries that can rival with Georgia. But to close down the business, to liquidate, or to resolve, whoo, lawyers have a feast, because it takes forever. So speeding up that process would help freeing up the capital that is stuck. Because, you know, when creditors don't know what they will get back, when the shareholders have no idea whether they will be wiped out or not, nobody invests. Capital is frozen. So all these ingredients, from connectivity to education and governance, have one thing in common. Government actions alone will not produce the results. It's going to be the product of government policies, but all stakeholders involved in the process. You will be involved. You need to be active and engaged. It will involve civil society. It will involve the private sector, the corporate actors. Everybody needs to be rowing in the same direction. And together, you can all make a difference. And I believe that it's in your direct interest as young people, because by transforming those components that I've just mentioned, you will actually transform the community that will host you for the future, where you will have, or you have your children. And this involves to take a wider perspective on your own skills. Because I wonder who in this room does not have a cell phone? Hands up. Okay. Who in this room has less than, say, 25 applications? Hands up. Ooh, 3. Okay, I'm not going to do the third one. My third one is, who in this room changes from one application to the other every 10 minutes? Okay, not many. Some of you, all right, granted. But what it means is that as much as you're interested in changing all the time, in checking some new things, you're interested in innovation, you're interested in creativity, you're interested in the new trend around the corner. And that will have an impact on your own skill set, on your own training, on your own educational process. And I can't help thinking of the vibrant music that you produce, of the startups that exist in Tbilisi. And because one of my sons is a restaurant owner and praise himself being a chef, not sure about that, but I think of your own chefs, famous around the world, and your winemaking processes. This is innovation and creativity the Georgian way, and you can deploy that to many other sectors, and you will make your mark too. Now, I'm going to close with one final topic, which I believe is critically important, which has a fiscal dimension, which makes it macro-critical. But it's one that we should all be concerned about, whether we are 94 years of age, like Sir David Attenborough, whose film I highly recommend, or whether you are an infant in the cradle. And that is our environment, and that is the impact that our behavior produces on climate change, which then transforms the environment, and how we want to secure the sustainability of that environment and not waste the planet that we were given. That has a fiscal dimension. We have advocated carbon tax. We have suggested a price per ton, but there are multiple dimensions in which you can yourself become also an advocate and an activist in your own life of those causes that actually go way beyond us. So, I would encourage all policymakers of Georgia to actually embrace that cause as well. Let me conclude with another quote from a great poet and statesman, Ilya Shavshavadze, who once said, Apologies for the English translation again, but it will resonate with you. A man creates his own destiny, but destiny does not create a man. That goes to the individual power and the collective power that you can harness in order to shape your destiny. There's nothing more noble than that. And when people rise, it's often because they want to have control over their destiny. All the best. Thank you.
Madame Lagarde, thank you very much for this very inspirational speech. I imagine under which impression I would have been if I had heard speech like that when I was a student, students which we have today in our audience. The issues you have been talking today about connectivity, about productivity, about women participation, about education, these were the things which mostly have not been discussed by the IMF 20 years ago. And I have to say that it's really because of your implementing this agenda that fund has become so accessible, so transparent, so understandable for many all over the world. When you have been talking about these issues, it reminded me what Amartya Sen said about reducing poverty. He said that if we want to reduce poverty, we should not be giving out money. We shouldn't be giving to people health and education. We have to care about skills and capabilities of our population, because if they have skills and capabilities, they will be able to do in very most difficult situation almost everything. And also the grasp by which you gave some developments and information about the Georgia very much says a lot how much attention you pay to all aspects of the country. So it's not just looking at the numbers, but what is also behind these numbers and how these numbers are working for the society. Again, thank you very much for your speech. And now I want to give a floor to our students who have unique opportunity to ask a question to the Managing Director of the IMF, Madame Christine Lagarde. Please. First, please.
It's me. Okay, hi. Greetings. It's a great honor to be directly asking you a question, Madame Lagarde. My name is Levan Mikeladze. I'm the second year student at the International School of Economics at Tbilisi State University. Also, I'm the International Monetary Fund Fund Challenge finalist. So my question is the following. About a month ago, on the spring meetings, IMF has announced that the global growth would have been lower than expected. But since then, some countries like the USA, like China, and like the European Union members have announced that the real growth is actually higher than the IMF has forecasted. It would be great if you could briefly elaborate on the issue of IMF's forecasting being lower than the real growth. Thanks.
Well, first of all, congratulations for being one of the finalists. That's great. Thank you for participating. You're right. There's one particular number which has surprised everybody, which was the US economy growth during the first quarter, which everybody was expecting to be in the high twos and was eventually 3.2%, which was largely attributable to inventory effect, but it's a solid number for the beginning of the year, and the first quarter of a year is actually making a significant impact on the overall year. But at the same time, our assessment of development in the course of 2019 was that the trade tensions would gradually over the course of the year abate, and that we were moving towards some sort of resolution of the tensions between particularly the United States and China. that doesn't seem to be heading in that direction, although I'm saying that with great qualification because things change very quickly. So one is probably tempered. In other words, the high unexpected number for the US economy in the first quarter is probably tempered by the continued tensions on an expanded basis, actually, in terms of not expanded basis, but expanded tariff rates from 10 to 25%. Forecasting is a very subtle art, and no one is the ultimate artist, right? Many forecasters get it right. We do too. But in the forecast that we had, there were elements of sort of general trends that we see going forward. There is the potential growth, which particularly in the advanced economies is rather low and generally lower than the growth that we've seen in the last year in particular. But you also have some identifiable countries which are taking a hit and having an impact on global growth. And that applies to the likes of Argentina, Turkey, Iran, where clearly we are seeing contraction, not to mention Venezuela, of course. So you combine all that, we still stand on our 3.3 for this year. Generally, as managing director of the IMF, if we got the forecast wrong and we have to up it, it's okay, Nobody remembers the bad number, everybody celebrates the new number. If we get it wrong and it has to be downgraded yet again, that's more of a concern because it means that there are more headwinds that we haven't anticipated. And it's always unpleasant.
Next question, please.
I am Ketevan Ediberidze, studying at Ilia State University. And my question is that how inclusive economic development cultivates economic opportunity and quality jobs for community residents? Is inclusive growth an ideal parameter to determine the development of any country?
I mentioned the four qualifiers to the concept of growth as discussed by the G20 and in many instances. We have done quite a lot of work on this concept of inclusive growth. And if you only narrow that inclusiveness to, say, women, which in many markets around the world are less welcome, less participating in the global economy or in their local economy, who have reduced or limited access to financing, there is a very significant potential to be tapped. I mentioned 11% per capita GDP increase in Georgia. There are countries where that increase is in the range of 25–30%. You look at India, you look at some of the Middle East countries in particular. So there is a significant upside to be had as a result. And that is only looking at the narrow angle, critically important, of women. But if you look at the sort of the gap that exists between the median salary and the top 1%, that variation has increased so monumentally in many countries, and not only in some of the advanced economies, that one can only question the impact on the overall welfare of the economy and the overall solidity of the social contract within economies. In many instances, you've seen wealth and income accumulation at one end, less distribution and redistribution, and very often you have this correlation between high wealth, high income, high education, which tends in many societies to just perpetuate itself. So not only do you have the gap and the frustration that come with it and the economic impact that come with it, but you also have this undermining of what matters so much in our life, which is hope. If middle-class family, as it happens now in advanced economies, and particularly in the United States, do not have the expectation that their children will go to good schools, will do better than them, you have this sort of resentment that sets in, which is not conducive to, strong and vibrant economy, which is not conducive to the desire to embrace innovation and to strive. So I think the concept of inclusiveness is very important from an economic point of view, but it's critically important from a social point of view as well.
Thank you, and just wanted to add that the fund's expertise is really very important, because this organization who collects and who analyzes data from all over the world. So you know what worked best in many countries and what can work in other countries. That is why sharing the experience of your analysis is really very important for us. Question, please.
Madam Lagarde, first of all, thank you for your really interesting speech. I'm Georgian Kepladze, and today I represent Agricultural State University. And my question is, former...
I love the way you have your question on your phone. Very helpful. Eh?
No, it's just... so the former chief economist of the World Bank and the leader of the new Keynesian economy school, Joseph Stiglitz, he was criticized in his famous book Globalization and its discontents the IMF and its policy towards developing countries like African, Asian, and post-Soviet countries. And he was saying that the policy was economically unreliable, and that some recommendations was really false and inefficient. Almost 70 years has passed, and I have a question. How has the policy of IMF changed, strategy of IMF changed to developing countries? Yeah, thank you.
Well, first of all, Joe Stiglitz was not around 70 years ago.
It was 2002.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make here is that since 75 years ago, which is when we started, the IMF has changed enormously over the course of time. Not just under my leadership, it has changed because it has to change. From setting exchange rate between currencies to what it does now in terms of advice in monetary policy, there's a world of difference. And the same goes for almost all categories. The work that we do on macroprudential and the links between the financial sector and the economy is something that we were not doing those years back. And the world has changed around us, and we need to just keep at it and continue changing, which is why we are putting a lot of effort on knowledge management, knowledge sharing, on improving the way in which we analyze the facts, and on trying to really continuously refine the authenticity of what we produce. So change is part of our DNA and has to continue to be part of our DNA. Sometimes we are perceived as very rigid, very disciplined, and we are, because we just have to keep that discipline that research requires. But we are an organization that changes over the course of time, number one. Number two, I think it was Globalization and the Discontent. That's the book that in which he criticized some of the principles. I think we have changed since that, and I've actually had discussions with Joe on this particular topic, and I don't think that today he would write the same things about the institution, because we are learning constantly, and I don't think that we are as exclusively focused on fiscal by all means, irrespective of everything else. I think, and if I have a little legacy when I one day retire, is hopefully to have enlarged our spectrum in a way that is accepted by the board, and we are lucky to have the presence of a board member who represents Georgia with us today. So that sort of broad spectrum leads us to look at some of the issues that I have just mentioned, which is, do women participate in the economy? Is the potential of young people leveraged in such a way that they find their space in society? Is inequality such that it acts as a brake on growth, on cohesiveness, on innovation? Are there additional factors that can be applied in order to reduce that? What is the impact of climate change on the financial stability of societies? How do we analyze their respective position? What is the measurement of externalities? And more importantly, what social safety net is there in society, particularly when we are called upon helping with a program and financing, because the country is in disarray and has not applied the right policy and needs to put some discipline in its finance. You know, we are trying to refine our tools all the time. And of course, fiscal discipline is going to have an impact on growth. We try to measure the multiplier effect in a better way. We've learned since previous programs back 10 years ago. And we need to continue doing that. But I think that the spectrum that we look at is not exclusively the numbers. It's not exclusively fiscal and monetary policy, but is broader than that and includes in particular that social dimension that I just mentioned. It's not easy, I can assure you. And I'm delighted that Jihad, who is the head of the department at the fund in charge of Georgia, is also convinced that we have to do that. And so is Mercedes, who is our mission chief, and our resident representative, Francois. Where are you? He's somewhere over there, back there, making sure that everything works. I think we're all on the same boat, but sometimes they're old-timers that have a difficult time. They say, why should we venture in those fields? Well, we have to, because otherwise it's not going to work. And we will create resentment and hostility. And the next time around, people will say, I'm not sure we want this to help us. The test of success is whether there is a repeat. You know, it's the same when whatever your destiny will be. If you go in the corporate sector, to get a new client is relatively easy. To get a repeat from that new client is far more difficult.
Just to add a few words, because we also talked a bit with the managing director yesterday, the fund has been changing so much all over the years. And the programs which the fund has now are so flexible and they can be accommodated to any situation of the country. Before it was very difficult if there was a problem somewhere to put together the program. There had to be a mission and long negotiations, but all developments, Asian crisis and 2008 financial crisis, it gave lessons to the IMF. And now it can mobilize assistance very, very quickly. Well, if the country is conducting good macro policies, it's even easier because it can be done almost instantly. So the change management in the fund, I have to say, is a very, very high level. This organization is as relevant as ever for global economy.
But you know, Papa, I think it was there. Sometimes it takes one person to trigger something, but it was in the organization, and you know that better than anybody else because you belong to the organization in your earlier years. So I think it was there. It was a question of just letting it out in many ways. But equally, as you know, the fund is not an ATM machine. So we do have those negotiations, we do have debates, we do have expectations of reforms because we engage international community money. It's not as if it was, you know, the IMF checkbook. It's the international community that is lending sometimes to countries. So we are accountable, and through us, the borrower is also accountable to the international community. But we are much more country-specific, probably. Yeah.
One more question.
Good morning. I'm David Keshelava, PhD candidate at Tbilisi State University. So first of all, thank you for very interesting and inspiring speech. It was great. My question is the following. What could be the role of Georgia in the regional and global value chains? And what could be done by IMF or other international organizations to increase potential of Georgia in this regard? Thank you.
That's a great question, because I think you are right to bring into this the regional dimension. In anything that you do, you have to look at what your strengths are and what the opportunities are, but you also have to look at your weaknesses and the threats. So you do that sort of quadrant analysis. And clearly your geographical position comes to mind instantly as an extraordinary asset that can be leveraged. You know, being positioned by the Black Sea, having this, you know, the ability to facilitate access of goods that are produced in the vicinity by some of your neighbors is something that really is a major opportunity. The beauty of your country and its tremendous assets call for more tourism, more diversified tourism. I understand that it's no longer just a summer destination, it's also now a fantastic skiing opportunity. You know, I have not skied on your slopes, but I would very much look forward to it. So you start with seeing the potential. I think the focus that is now on education is vitally important because you are a well-educated country in the main, but you want to push yourself up in the value chain to make sure that you really leverage the brain power that you can harness. And the region will need that. The region will need those sort of added value fields that are finance, that are smart logistics, where clearly the new technologies have a major bearing. So I would say that the focuses that we see on education, critically important, connectivity, critically important as well, and that is predicated on the analysis of the assets that your country has. I can't insist enough on governance because, you know, because of my background and because of what I have seen around the world. When all branches of government operate all in the same direction, with enough degree of checks, balances, and independence vis-à-vis each other, then it is supportive of that kind of inclusive growth and sustainable project for the country.
Thank you very much, Madame Lagarde. Thank you for your speech. I also want to thank students for coming today, for listening to this inspirational speech. I'm sure that they will draw a lot from what they have heard today. I also want to say that International Monetary Fund is an organization which produces the highest quality analysis of economic issues. So if you are interested in economics, and I know that you are, do visit IMF website and read these reports because they are just excellent. And at the same time, yes, please.
I just want to add as a great follow-up to what you're saying, and if you are interested in economics and you are at PhD level and are looking at options, we are recruiting, okay? Think about it.
That's important because I was the first ever Georgian economist who started to work for the fund. And there are more economists in Georgia, and I'm sure that there will be more Georgian economists at the fund. And in addition to IMF analysis, please also visit our website of the National Bank of Georgia, because we produce also very good analysis of developments, quarterly reports, annual reports, and you will find a lot about global economy, about regional economy, and of course about Georgia. At the end of our lecture, I want to present Managing Director a coin. This is a silver coin which was issued this year to commemorate 100 years since announcement of First Georgian Republic. I want Madame Lagarde to accept this on behalf of the students which we have today. And again, thank you very much for coming to Georgia.